I walked into that office expecting to explode. I walked out not knowing who I was anymore. My wife was sitting across from the man who destroyed my career, calm as a Sunday morning, 2 cups of coffee between them like old friends catching up. And just before I found my voice, she reached into her bag and placed something on his desk. Something small, something that made his face go completely white. I stood there frozen in that doorway, and everything I thought I knew about the last 14 years started to crack. If you enjoy stories that pull you in and make you question everyone involved, take a second to subscribe and leave a like. It really does help these stories reach more people who need to hear them. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'm always genuinely amazed at how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that office, you need to understand what I gave to get there. I started at Hargrove Consolidated when I was 29 years old. Junior accounts manager, entry level, grateful just to have a desk with my name on a sticky note. The company was mid-sized, the kind of place where if you worked hard and kept your head down, you could build something real. And that's exactly what I told myself every single morning for 14 years. I gave that company everything. That's not self-pity. That's just fact. I worked weekends when nobody asked me to. I covered for colleagues who were struggling. I trained people who eventually got promoted above me. And I smiled and shook their hands because I believed that loyalty had a long memory. I believed that the people at the top noticed. I believed a lot of things back then. My wife, Diane, she noticed different things. We met when I was 26, married at 28, and by the time I hit my 5th year at Hargrove, she had started saying things quietly. Not arguments, just quiet observations, the kind that slide under a door instead of breaking it down. Things like, "You've missed dinner 4 times this week," or, "I told you about my sister's birthday 2 months ago." Small sentences with a weight I didn't want to measure. I told myself I was building something for us, for our future. That's what men like me say when we're avoiding the harder truth, which is that work had become the thing that made me feel competent when everything else felt uncertain. We had financial pressure, real pressure. We bought a house in 2018 at the wrong time, just before the market shifted, and the mortgage was heavier than we'd planned. Diane worked too. She was an office administrator at a medical practice. Good at her job, reliable. But we were stretched. Every month was a calculation. And I used that as my justification for every late night, every missed anniversary dinner, every moment I chose the desk over the couch. My boss, Raymond Holt, had been above me for the last 6 of those 14 years. He was the kind of man who wore confidence like a suit that was tailored specifically to intimidate. Not cruel exactly, more like precise. He had a way of giving you just enough praise to keep you moving and just enough distance to remind you where you stood. I respected him the way you respect a weather system. You don't question it. You just adjust. He never raised his voice. That should have told me something. Men who never raise their voice have usually found quieter ways to get what they want. Looking back now, I can spot the signs I walked past like they were furniture. The way the quarterly reviews started feeling slightly off. The way I'd send detailed reports and get back responses that were shorter than usual. The way Raymond stopped inviting me to the Thursday briefings, explaining it away as a restructuring of the meeting format. I nodded. I kept working. I told myself these things happened in cycles and that my track record would speak for itself when the cycle turned. It didn't. The morning I was fired was a Tuesday in November. Cold. The kind of gray that sits on your shoulders. Raymond called me into his office just before 10. His assistant didn't make eye contact when she told me he wanted to see me, and I remember thinking that was odd. I walked in and he was standing by the window, not seated at his desk, and something about that posture told me the conversation was already over before it started. He was careful with his words. Restructuring. Realignment of departmental priorities. My role was being eliminated. It wasn't performance-based. He was sorry. There would be a severance package. HR would walk me through the details. 14 years, 20 minutes, a handshake. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 45 minutes before I could drive. I kept waiting to feel something clear, like rage or grief. But what I felt instead was a strange, buzzing numbness, like every nerve in my body had just agreed to go offline simultaneously. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table. I waited for Diane to come home from work. When she walked in that evening, I told her straight. No buildup, no softening. I just said it. I got fired today. It's done. She put her bag down slowly. She sat across from me. She asked questions, practical ones, about the severance, about health insurance, about what came next, and I answered them as clearly as I could, even though my voice felt like it belonged to someone else. Then something shifted in her face, something I couldn't read at the time, a kind of stillness that wasn't calm, more like someone making a decision. She went to bed early that night. I stayed up watching television I wasn't watching. The next morning, she packed a bag. Not everything, just enough. A weekender bag, her laptop bag, some things from the bathroom. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and watched her move quietly and efficiently, and I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. I asked her what she was doing. She said she needed a few days, that she had things to figure out, that she would be in touch. I asked if there was someone else. She didn't answer that. She just picked up her bags and she left. I stood in the middle of our kitchen for a long time after I heard her car pull away. Then I sat on the floor, which is something I hadn't done since I was maybe 8 years old, and I just sat there, because there was nowhere else I could think to go. The following 3 days were the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. It's the quiet of a house that knows something you don't yet. I barely ate. I didn't sleep properly. I replayed every conversation Diane and I had over the last year, then the last 3 years, looking for the moment I should have caught, the sentence that would explain why she left the minute things got hard. I called her twice. Both times she picked up, told me she was okay, told me she needed more time, and told me she would explain everything soon. The second time I pushed harder and she said, "Please just trust me for a few more days." Her voice was steady in a way that didn't comfort me. It unsettled me. I decided it didn't matter. I decided she had shown me exactly who she was. I decided that when the storm hit, my wife had walked out the door, and that was something I wasn't sure I could come back from. By day 3, I had cycled through grief and arrived somewhere harder and colder. I called the company and arranged to come collect my personal items from my desk. I thought it would give me some closure, a physical ending to something that still didn't feel real. I arrived at the Hargrove building on a Thursday morning. The receptionist, a young woman who had always been genuinely kind to me, gave me a look I could only describe as uncomfortable, not unfriendly, just like she knew something she wasn't sure she was supposed to know. The office smelled exactly the same as it always had, that particular mix of recycled air and printer toner and someone's coffee that's been sitting too long. 14 years of mornings inside that smell. It hit me harder than I expected. People at their desks noticed me. A couple of them gave small nods, the kind you give when you want to acknowledge someone without committing to a conversation. Others suddenly found their screens very interesting. I kept my face neutral and walked toward my old desk. I had a cardboard box. I hadn't brought a big one because I'd told myself I wasn't going to be dramatic about this. Just get the things and leave. I picked up the framed photo of Diane and me at the coast 2 summers ago. I picked up a small plant that had somehow survived on my windowsill for years. I cleared out my drawers methodically, keeping my breathing even. That's when I heard her laugh. Not loud, just a brief natural laugh, the sound of someone who's at ease, the sound I used to fall asleep to. It came from the direction of Raymond's office, whose glass partition faced the main floor. I turned slowly, and there she was, Diane, sitting in the chair across from Raymond's desk, leaning slightly forward, a coffee cup in front of her. Raymond was seated. They were talking. She looked settled, comfortable in a way that made my stomach drop 6 floors. My vision went strange at the edges. I took 3 steps toward the office and then stopped, because something in my chest was rising, and I genuinely couldn't tell if it was going to come out as words or not. I opened my mouth and nothing came. Diane reached into her bag. She pulled out a manila envelope, thick, the kind that holds documents rather than letters. She set it down on Raymond's desk and slid it across to him with a deliberateness that told me she'd been planning this moment for longer than 3 days. Raymond looked at the envelope. He didn't open it immediately. He looked up at Diane, and his face did something I had never in 6 years seen it do. It went pale. I must have made a sound, because Diane turned and saw me. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who had been expecting me and had hoped for a slightly different moment. Raymond saw me too. He said nothing. Diane stood up. She walked to the door of his office and opened it, and she said quietly, "Come in. I'm glad you're here." I walked in because I couldn't think of what else to do. I looked at the envelope on the desk. Then I looked at her. She said, "Sit down, please." I sat, and then my wife told me what had actually happened and what she had been doing for the last 3 days while I was at home, convincing myself that she had abandoned me. Diane had known something was wrong at Hargrove for almost 4 months before I was fired. She had known because 8 months ago she had started looking into our finances more carefully, the way she sometimes did, and she had noticed a series of small discrepancies in our joint accounts. Nothing alarming on its own, but Diane was careful and methodical in a way I had never fully appreciated, and she had followed a thread. That thread led her somewhere unexpected. 4 months earlier, a former colleague of mine, a woman named Patricia, who had left the company the year before, had reached out to Diane directly. Not to me, to Diane. Patricia had been trying to reach someone who would listen, and she had calculated correctly that I was too close to the situation to hear it clearly. What Patricia told Diane was this: Raymond Holt had been systematically misattributing work. For years, specifically the accounts that I had managed, developed, and grown had been documented internally as Raymond's strategic initiatives. The results that had made Raymond look exceptional to the board, the results that had contributed directly to his last 2 promotions, were built on work that had my name on the original drafts and his name on every report that went upward. He hadn't been building his career. He'd been building it out of mine. And when the board began scrutinizing departmental efficiency earlier this year, Raymond had made a quiet decision. The easiest way to protect what he had built on borrowed credit was to remove the person who could, if they ever looked closely, trace the original work back to its actual source. That was why I was fired. Not restructuring, not realignment. I was removed because I had become a liability to a man who had been stealing from me for years. Diane had spent 3 days with Patricia, going through documentation, emails that Patricia had saved, internal drafts with timestamps, version histories that hadn't been properly scrubbed. She had taken it all to an employment attorney, a friend of a friend who had agreed to look at it over 2 evenings. And the attorney had said clearly that what was in those documents represented grounds for a wrongful termination case and potentially more. The envelope on Raymond's desk contained a letter from that attorney and a preliminary summary of the documentation. Diane had come here not to meet with Raymond socially. She had come here to deliver the beginning of consequences. I looked at my wife sitting next to me in that office. I looked at Raymond, whose careful composure had entirely left him. I thought about the 3 days I had spent convinced that she had walked out on me, that she was the worst version of what I'd imagined, that when things fell apart she had chosen herself and left me alone in the wreckage. She had left because she needed space to build the thing that might actually save us. She hadn't told me because she knew me well enough to know that if I'd been aware of what she was doing, I would have gotten in the way of it. I would have been too angry, too reactive, too proud to let it unfold carefully. She knew that the only way to do this right was to do it without me, and she had made that call and carried it entirely on her own. I didn't know whether to be grateful or devastated that she knew me that well. Raymond asked if we could discuss this privately. Diane said no. She said everything that needed to be discussed would go through the attorney. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at Raymond one more time, not with anger, just with a steadiness that communicated everything. And then she looked at me and said, "Are you ready to go?" I picked up my cardboard box from where I'd left it outside the office door. The plant was still in it, the photo of us at the coast. We walked out of that building together. In the weeks that followed, things moved in ways I still can't fully process. The employment attorney filed formally. The documentation was strong enough that Hargrove's legal team moved quickly to settle rather than let discovery begin. The settlement I received was not a fortune, but it was significant, and it came with a signed acknowledgement that my termination had not been performance-related, which mattered more to me than I expected it to. Raymond Holt resigned before he was asked to. I heard later that the board had conducted a quiet internal review after the attorney's letter was received. I don't know exactly what consequences found him beyond that. Part of me wanted more. Part of me understood that what had already happened to him, the loss of the carefully built reputation, the exposure of what he actually was, might be its own particular punishment for a man whose identity was entirely constructed from how others saw him. Diane and I didn't just slide back to normal. That wouldn't have been honest. I had to sit with the discomfort of what her 3 days of silence had revealed about both of us, about how well she knew my flaws, about how she had decided in a crisis not to lean on me, but to work around me. That's not entirely a loving portrait of who I was in our marriage. A man his wife trusts completely doesn't get quietly circumvented. He gets looped in. We talked about that, not once, but many times. About the years I had given to a company instead of to her. About the financial pressure I had made both of us carry by making work my primary identity. About the moments she had tried to tell me something was wrong, and I had reclassified her concern as something manageable rather than something worth stopping for. She was not without her own accounting either. She should have told me what she was doing. The silence, however strategic, had put me through 3 days of a particular kind of grief that leaves a mark. She knew that. She said so without me having to tell her. We went to counseling, the kind neither of us had ever imagined we'd need, and it was uncomfortable and slow, and occasionally the most useful thing I've ever done. I found new work eventually. A smaller company, less prestigious, less pressure, the kind of place where my contribution is visible and documented and mine. I am less important there than I was at Hargrove by every external measure. I am less erased. I think about that moment in the office doorway sometimes. The moment when I saw my wife sitting calmly across from the man I blame for everything. And I was so certain I understood what I was seeing. 14 years of loyalty to someone who was using me. 3 days of believing the person who actually had my back had turned it. A lifetime of working so hard at the wrong things that I nearly missed the one person who was, quietly and at considerable personal cost, working on my behalf. The object on the desk was a legal document, but what it represented was something harder to name. It was my wife deciding, in the worst week of our lives, that she was going to fight for us even if I couldn't see the fight happening. Even if I spent those days thinking she was the enemy. I don't know that I deserve that. I'm not sure deserving is the right framework. I know that I'm still learning, slowly, how to be in a life with someone rather than just adjacent to one. And I know that when I walked out of that building with my cardboard box and my plant and the photo from the coast, with Diane walking next to me through those familiar automatic doors for the last time, I was walking towards something I hadn't known how to walk toward in years. Myself and her at the same time. Finally. If this story stayed with you, I'd genuinely love to know what you would have done in my place. Leave it in the comments. And if you felt it, like, subscribe and share. It means more than you know.